Hi, this is Carol Ann. Welcome to September on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. So glad you could be here with us. Hope you enjoy all the fun of season 6. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics, where we take a look at all of the ways that history shows us what's possible today. And I am thrilled to welcome to the podcast Breeze Barrington, a historian and author that I have been fascinated by her work. So, welcome, Breeze, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you.
Well, we'll just jump right in. I always like to ask people who are studying history, what is it that brought you to history? What was your first introduction, or what got you excited about history?
It's an interesting, it's a very difficult question in some ways for me to answer because I feel that history was always a part of my life. So I come from a long line of English and history teachers. So I think that I was, as a child, always being told stories about the past, being taken to museums. Yeah, it was sort of always part of my DNA, if you like. But I think if I were to pick a moment where I really remember history coming alive for me is probably when I went to Hampton Court Palace as a child, which I used to do frequently. My granny lived quite near to there, so we used to visit quite often. But I do remember just getting incredibly excited, particularly about Catherine Howard for some reason. I mean, not that she isn't exciting, she is, but of all of the wives, it was quite interesting that she was the one who, as a child, I was particularly enthused by. But yes, I remember those visits to Hampton Court and feeling history kind of coming alive as perhaps a gateway moment for me.
Oh, that's wonderful. And Hampton Court is a magical place. So I'm intrigued because you then sort of shifted. So you would think, oh, maybe you would become a Tudor historian. But in fact, you shifted a little to the 17th, to the followers of the Tudors. So what sort of inspired that?
That really happened at university when I was doing my undergraduate degree. I think, particularly throughout my masters, and then so by the time I got to sort of PhD and then to sort of writing this book, I was a strong convert. But I think it was really during the second year of my undergraduate degree. I mean, I had across all of my modules, I had the most brilliant academics teaching me. I was incredibly fortunate. But there was something about the 17th century where I just thought, this is so exciting. You know, there's just so much that happens at this time, and it's so much less known about, I think. And of course, you have wonderful literature that comes out of the 16th century, but you have some just phenomenal work coming out of the 17th, which I found sort of much more challenging and much more, and for that reason, more exciting. I think, you know, when I first read Paradise Lost, I had to keep having timeouts because it was just too good. So I think there were lots of things that drew me to it, but it was really during that period when I started to get excited about the literature, started to get excited about the history, and that just grew and grew the more I studied it, and it still grows. It's still very strong.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that because the 16th century has sort of a big fan base and the
Mm.
17th century, not so much. It's just not as well known. And we'll talk about your book in particular, because one of the many fascinating characters of the 17th century in that time period is Mary of Modena. And what drew you to her in particular? Because she's maybe not the flashiest, certainly not the most well known. I mean, I think she's often so overlooked. So, what drew you to her story?
It's true. I mean, she's probably the least known, really, probably the least known queen of all of them. Um, you know, partly I suppose because she was queen for only 3 years, maybe that's part of it. But she was in England for quite a while before that. So I don't know. It's a whole time period, not just the 17th century, but actually particularly this sort of post 1660 world. Actually, I think which is very little known, and certainly kind of post 1680. I think very little is talked about until you get sort of post Glorious Revolution, and then things pick up a bit. Um, what drew me to her specifically, it's certainly not something I was expecting. So when I sort of say that I got excited about the 17th century when I was doing my degree and throughout all my studies, I was initially focusing really on the earlier period of that, the sort of court of Charles I period, and lots of the artistic production that was happening at that time. And I think after my PhD, I probably expected initially to stay in that sphere, but everything really changed for me when I went to an exhibition. So I was reviewing an exhibition at a gallery called the Lion and Tumble Gallery. It's a private gallery in London, and the exhibition was called Bright Souls, and it was of the first three professional female artists working in England. So this is all across the 17th century. And one of these painters was called Anne Killigrew. And one of the paintings in the exhibition by Anne Killigrew was a work called Venus Attired by the Graces. And I mean, it's an incredibly beautiful, beautiful painting, and it totally captivated me visually. But when I started reading about it, it became interesting in different ways too. So I found out that it's thought to be an allegory. So Venus is representing Maria of Modena, and the three Graces represent her maids of honor, one of whom was Anne Killigrew, the painter of the work, and she really puts herself in pride of place there. And then the other Graces, maids, were thought to be Anne Finch, the great poet who I'd studied at university and whose work I thought had always been thrilling. So this was her when she's much younger. This is her sort of before she's a professional writer, if you like. This is her as a teenager, essentially, or at least early 20s. The other Grace, they suggested could be Sarah Churchill, who this would also be before she was married. This was her age, sort of, mid-teens, really, much before The Favourite, much before her friendship with Princess Anne. So she actually was one of Maria's first maids of honor when Maria first arrived in 1673. So I sort of looked at this painting and I thought about, these women together at this time, the sort of underrepresented era, underrepresented court. I knew not that much about Maria when I first saw the painting, although I knew about some of the women who were around her. And I thought, well, gosh, this is exciting. I'll think about that. Maybe one day I'll do something with that. And it was, a few years later that I just sort of that I then met my agent and I started working on this as a book full time, having been sort of collecting it, fermenting it in my brain for the years in between.
That's a wonderful story and a reminder to all of us about the visual and the literary together, capturing these moments and capturing especially the women. And I think that's really important. And I really love that idea of Venus and her attendants. And I love the way you say Maria. So I will say that now because it was very anglicized into Mary. So tell us about her, because she has this shorter time as queen. Then there's the time before she becomes queen while she's in England, married to James. But even before that, I think many of us know almost nothing about her life. So tell us about who she was before she became this Queen of England, Queen Consort.
Yeah, I would just say that I call her Maria partly because when I was writing the book, so many people were called Mary that it
Mm.
became a useful way of differentiating her from the other ones. But you're right, when she came to England, her name was anglicized to Mary, so she will have been known as Mary at the English court. So I've got it stuck in my head now as Maria because it was useful for me.
Yeah.
But also it felt kind of important to try and retain that Italianness that she always held, I suppose. Yeah, so we know a little more about her than we might about other sort of women, if you like, other women in England, certainly at this time. I mean, one of the things you were saying about the importance of art and literature, being the sort of representation of these things at that time, is as you say, there's so little that survives about these women so much of the time. I mean, Anne Killigrew, the painter of that work, we know next to nothing about, but she tells us a lot through her paintings. The painting that I just described, that's evidence, right? That's a sort of glimpse, that's a sort of hint left behind, that's a visual diary, if you like. So their work is integral to reconstructing their lives in a time when women's work, women's letters, women's histories weren't sort of routinely recorded. These are wonderful ways that we can try and find something out. So Maria was born into the Este family. the Estes were a significant ruling dynasty, one of England's, one of Italy's really great ruling families, along with the Medici, along with the Borgias, who are perhaps better known. But the Estes had been one of these huge dynastic families. By the time Maria was born, they were somewhat in decline. So they held far fewer territories than they had before, and they were operating through, I would say, more of a soft power than a military power, which they had been before. And this is partly because when one part of the dynasty, when the sort of the head of the dynasty died at one point, the Pope sort of wrested some of the very lucrative, fertile lands away from the family, and you don't really mess with the Pope. So there's a sense that they sort of have to retreat to some of their smaller principalities, and they end up in Modena when they had been in Ferrara before. So she's born into this dynasty that has a sense of greatness, which has a sense of decline, which is still has a place, a big place in the sort of the world of Italy, but is still working out what its remit is within that, I suppose. She's the only daughter of this dynasty, and her younger brother, who's very, very young, is the Duke of Modena. Her father died when they were both children. So her mother, Laura, is acting as regent at this time. And she's a very powerful woman, and she's highly educated. She's very brilliant and formidable. And she's determined that both of her children will be raised to be, worthy of the name of Este. And they're both going to be very, very well educated, and they're both going to be strong and powerful in their own rights. So the fact that she's a girl, the fact that Maria's a girl, doesn't matter. She's going to be brought up to be strong and proud and powerful. When she was very young, she decided that she wanted to become a nun. So there was a convent attached to the palace, which had actually been founded by her mother. And all she really wanted was to join this convent and to take the veil. And it seems that she never really was given an indication that this might not happen. And it's quite possible that her mother supported her in this. I mean, if your daughter has that strong a vocation from that young an age, perhaps there is the part of you that thinks, well, maybe we'll let her do this. At the same time, the only daughter of a big ruling family is much more likely to be advantageously married within the great families of Europe. A daughter is really the only opportunity that a monarchy or a principality in this case would have to spread their dynasty abroad. So although she thought she could become a nun, her fate was probably, realistically sealed before that. So when in 1671, James, Duke of York, the heir to the English throne, needed a new wife. His wife, Ann Hyde, died that year. When he needed a new wife, all eyes sort of turned to the courts of Europe, and an ambassador was sent out, and Maria was the princess that he picked from all the others. And so she was taken. I mean, initially she tried very hard to resist, but the Pope wrote her a letter and told her, I appreciate that you want to give your life to God, but you should give your life to God by marrying James. It is you will serve him better by essentially bringing Catholicism back to England. She was charged by the Pope with this task, that James was it was not sort of official, but it was an open secret that James had converted to Catholicism. She's a Catholic princess. If they have children, they could be born and raised in the Catholic faith, and England gets that much closer to being reunited with the papacy. So this is her 15 years old, or 14 years old when this letter arrives, being told she can't become a nun. She has to go to this country that she's never heard of, and to marry a man who was 40 years old, significantly older than her, to bring this entire nation back to the papal fold. It must have been the most enormous, crushing feeling, essentially. I mean, this is her whole life that's just been turned upside down, and she's only 14. She was 15. It was her 15th birthday that she left Modena for England, 1673.
Well, imagine that. So not only do you have to give up your life plan to become a nun, but the responsibility of returning England. And England has been pretty resistant to becoming Catholic again for quite a while. It has not gone well. So that must have been an enormous responsibility for someone so young and difficult to be excited about for her. That,
Yeah,
becoming a
absolutely.
princess in England doesn't sound so good at that point.
No, and she, as I said, she'd never heard of England. It hadn't been part of her education, extensive education, but England wasn't really very important to her at that time. She didn't know where it was, she didn't know what it was. And this, all of that context of the break with Rome that had happened a century before, and all of the ongoing, I mean, to say unsettlement, would be to put it mildly, all of the turmoil essentially which had followed it and which was still going on, she won't really have known about this. So she's being tasked with bringing England back to the papacy, but she really has no idea what that's going to, in practice, be like. And I imagine she will have found out very quickly what a big rift there was, and I think she would have found out quite quickly how dangerous a task something like that was. And certainly when James had converted to Catholicism sort of formally, not long after she arrived, it was to real outcry. And people did know, as I said, it was an open secret, but the actual sort of public doing of it, what he did was he was going with his brother to church, and he stopped outside the door and he turned around and said he wouldn't enter. And it was this big public display that he is no longer going to worship as a Protestant. Huge outcries about it, and this sort of terror of what's going to happen when he becomes king. So yes, whole life, I would say, in England was completely dominated by this rift between Catholicism and Protestantism. Very few Catholics in England at that time, but the sort of the fear, the Protestant fear of it was very strong.
Well, and the not too distant example of the power of this very Protestant parliament, because James's own father, Charles the First, had been executed by Parliament. And so it was a very dangerous, as you say, it's not just uncomfortable with a family with different religions. It was very dangerous for her. But she
Yeah.
carries on, she marries James. And so what happens as she becomes the queen? He is the king. There is now a Catholic monarch on the throne with his wife. How does that go?
Yes, well, so the years that she would have spent as Duchess of York before she became Queen will have shown her just the level of tightrope that she was walking on. Her and James actually lived in exile for many years during that time. And, sort of she's in England actually for 15 years before she became Queen. And so she has a really decent amount of time to kind of get a sense of what's going on and get a sense of where the land lies, if you like. And when she went into exile initially, it was because there had been sort of rumors, fake rumors of a kind of a supposed Catholic plot. This man Titus Oates had come forward and had claimed that he had seen a document with the signatories of hundreds of Catholics, and that they were going to basically topple the crown, and it was going to be a sort of Bartholomew's Days massacre-esque killing of Protestants in this case. And so in the sort of Catholic uprising all over the country. And although the people that he accused, the things he said were really quite obviously not true, they really hit a nerve, and I think a lot of people wanted to believe something like this. It sort of confirmed their prejudices, and it sort of spoke to their deepest fears. There are comparable situations of conspiracy theories taking hold, even when they're clearly quite bonkers. But this was a really, really dreadful time. People were executed for treason when they hadn't done anything wrong, including people very close to Maria, including her private secretary, for example. And some of the sort of the major Catholic aristocrats in the country, people like the Earl of Stafford. So Marie and James were sent into exile by Charles at this point, thinking that if they weren't there, maybe things would die down a bit. This is all because of this sort of fear of what's going to happen with them as the heirs. Charles has no legitimate children. It's quite clear he won't have any, that James remains the heir. So she has this very, very clear idea of how public feeling is against them, or against Catholicism anyway. I mean, she personally was very popular but her religion was not. And so she has this really clear sense of the public against them, of Parliament particularly against them, Parliament really against James. While they're away, they try to put through this exclusion crisis, which would have had this exclusion bill, which became known as the exclusion crisis, and it would have seen him removed from being heir to the throne, removed from the line of succession. So she knows how dangerous all of this is, and how hard it's going to be. So this is what she's kind of lived through, if you like, before she became queen. So when that time came in 1685, she didn't know what was going to happen. Essentially, I think her and James both thought, we don't know if this is going to be accepted. James gave a very sort of pretty speech to Parliament in which he said, I'm not going to change anything. You guys just carry on. Don't worry, essentially. And everyone was very happy and very relieved. And they said, oh, good. And they gave him this enormous amount of money, which is far more than they'd given to Charles when he became king. Probably because of a sort of sense of relief. Maybe this will be fine. They quickly found that they were wrong, and James gradually started to do many of the things he promised that he wouldn't do. And relations started to unravel between him and Parliament. Essentially, James had learned all the wrong lessons, I think, from the death of his father. He believed that anyone who disagreed with him was against him, that Parliament were sort of inherently against him, and he basically believed that if his father had been stronger and mightier, then none of it would have happened. His sense was, you've got to show them who's boss. And that's just not the way that Parliament works. That's not the way that the systems of power work at this point. He's not an absolute monarch as much as he wants to be. Right. And so these relations completely break down essentially over a period of 3 years. And during this time, Maria was blamed for quite a lot of it, I think. It was thought that she had a lot of influence over him, that she, as this, Italian Catholic, must be the one driving him. But actually, it's really quite the opposite. She's trying to be more of a moderating force. She's trying to say, I don't think you should do these things so quickly. People don't want to be pushed, and just tone it down a little bit. But you're with me, you're against me is very much James's view. So these 3 years in which their king and queen are very, very tense and rapidly go downhill. This all comes to a head when Maria becomes pregnant in 1687. Up until that point, he as a king may not be what Parliament want him to be, but they sort of also recognize that he's only going to be king, until he's dead, essentially. After that, they'll get a nice Protestant in. So his daughter from his first marriage, Princess Mary, who was married to William of Orange in Holland. I think, well, if we just stick this out, I imagine they were thinking, if we stick this out, we'll get her in the end. Then when Maria becomes pregnant, all of that can change. So there can be this male heir, there can be this Catholic heir, this heir that the Pope had told her was her duty to have. So she's always in this really difficult tension between maintaining her role in England as this English Duchess and then English Queen, and trying to be good at that, trying to keep relations good with people, to try to to flourish in that environment, but also the sense of what the Pope has told her to do. Mm-hmm. And these are constantly against each other. And yes, this all comes to a head in 1687 in December, when her pregnancy is announced. And the child that is born in June causes a great deal of upheaval, which I think we'll probably come on to.
Yes, because traditionally, when a queen consort has a son, it's a good thing. I mean, think about how hard Henry VIII tried, and that was not that recent of history. And it was such a disappointment when it turned out that Charles II was not going to have any. I mean, he certainly had plenty of illegitimate children, but he was not going to have a legitimate son to take over instead of James. And so this idea of a baby boy, and, people felt that way for a long time. But this baby boy that Maria has is seen as a direct threat to Protestantism, because of course this child will be raised as a Catholic, and with the male preference for in male primogenitor, he will leapfrog both of his grown-up sisters and becomes the heir to the throne. So this causes one of my favorite scandals just because it is so absurd. So tell us about how that is received and the lengths to which Parliament goes to pretend it didn't happen.
This must be the only instance where when a male heir is born, they think, no, we'd rather have the female heir. Up to this point, the sense, there's a really strong sense, oh, women can't rule. This is not an equal society. This is not a society which welcomes a female ruler. So the birth of a baby boy, you're right, would normally be this great cause of celebration. But in this case, it's absolutely abysmal for the majority of people at court and in the country at large. This is a boy who has been born to two openly Catholic parents and who will be raised in the church. And this will be the first time that would have happened, that a baby would have been born into the Catholic faith, raised in the Catholic faith in England since that break with Rome. So this is a monumental moment. In some ways, in order to talk about the birth, we need to go back a little bit through the pregnancy. So from the point from which the pregnancy was announced in December, rumors start to circulate, and those rumors say that Maria is not really pregnant at all. They say that she's too old to have children. She's 29. She's too old to have children. It's been a couple of years since she was last pregnant, so obviously she's now past it. All of these things start being said about her, and as the pregnancy progresses, I suppose the people who initially say she's not pregnant start to say, well, she's just stuffing a cushion up her top. There are still some people who believe she is pregnant, but when she gets a letter with false information saying that her brother has died and she collapses in grief, before being told, oh no, that's not true, he hasn't died at all, people then say, oh, well, she had a miscarriage. She's lost the baby. She's just pretending to continue to be pregnant. So the amount of people who believe in this pregnancy, dwindle and dwindle. And the court becomes obsessed with trying to see her naked and trying to touch her stomach. It's important to say at this time that dressing and undressing for the Queen of England is not a fully private affair. There are going to always be other people in the room, but the amount of people who want to be present starts to get a bit out of control, and how close they want to be becomes excessive. And this constant desire to touch her stomach, to try and feel the baby, I think it is still a thing that people like to try and touch pregnant women's stomachs without their consent. Imagine if this is just hundreds of people at the court all the time. This is a really, really intense situation for her. And she gradually starts to try and shut herself off a bit. She knows what people are saying. She's frightened and she's hurt, and she's also defiant. She's also, how can anyone believe these terrible things? How could anyone think I would actually do that? And she starts to slightly shut off, and she allows less and less access, which obviously fuels the rumors. So by the time we actually get to the point of the birth where no one's believed that she was pregnant at all, everyone is saying she's going to try and smuggle a baby in. They don't know how, but that's what they think is going to happen. So when that moment comes on the 10th of June, 1688, James calls as many people as he can get a hold of to go and witness this birth. Again, a queen giving birth is not a private thing. There would always have been people present. There will always have been courtiers. There will always have been important politicians. But James gets as many people as he physically can, preferably Protestants, because their word will carry more weight in this situation. So by the time the room is full, by the time the baby comes, if you like, there are between 70 and 80 people in that room. Most of them are going to be men. And James really calls the important people in Parliament, the people who really need to witness this, to stand closer and closer, to stand at the end of the bed, to have a really good look. And it gets to this point where Maria says to him, I can't bear to see all of these men looking on me. She asks him to cover her face. So he puts his wig over her face so she can't see. I mean, it's a horrendous situation. And all the while, these people are kind of pressing closer and closer. When the moment comes, the baby is born. It's said to be a boy, and James asks the people, the Parliament, the big members of Parliament, to follow the child into the next room where he'll be, cleaned and he'll be swaddled. Like, he doesn't want anyone to not to have a minute without someone having an eye on this child, someone of significance having an eye on this child. And he says, everyone, you've all seen this. You can all see this boy has been born, and it's all very, very public. But after the birth, people say that it wasn't real. People say that the child was smuggled into the room in a warming pan. A warming pan is basically a sort of metal contraption which has hot coals inside it, which you put inside of it. It's like a hot water bottle. You put it inside the bed to warm the bed. And people say that this bedpan that went into the bed, even though people witnessed it was full of hot coals, they say, no, it had a baby boy in it. And the boy was then sort of brought out at the exact moment. And that's what happened. So either she had never been pregnant, so there was no baby, so this fake one was used, or alternatively, when they realized it was a girl that was born, they swapped it for this boy that was just waiting very patiently in this warming pan. So this is essentially the rumor that happens. I think it's important to say as well, this is not even the first time that this rumor started to go about. So when she had been pregnant a few years before that, rumor started then that they were going to try and substitute, if it was a girl, they were going to try and substitute it for a boy. So this wasn't the first time this rumor had been tested. That time the child had been a girl, didn't really need to worry about it. She hadn't been queen yet anyway. But that was a kind of laying the foundations, I suppose, working out how best to circulate this horrific rumor, so that when this moment came, they were fully prepared. And where they think this baby came from is also quite wild. So there are stories of prominent Catholics sort of scouting around cities like Oxford and London, trying to find pregnant women to basically take them back to Whitehall Palace, and then they'd have these sort of babies ready to substitute. This kind of collecting of women and potential babies is completely, I mean, obviously it's completely wild, but this is what they thought happened. So after the birth, pamphlets start to circulate, some of which say things like that. Other ones sort of have these sort of lascivious images of Maria being seduced by this chap, Father Peter, who was James's trusted advisor and who was widely hated in the country. So there are all these different rumors. So it's not her baby, and James has been cuckolded, and all of this is basically to do as much damage as they possibly can to try and say this is not a legitimate future king of England.
So just imagine, I mean, she's gone through all of that, all those people in the room, and they still come up with these absurd stories that must have been incredibly, besides being politically an insult, just personally painful with everything she's gone through.
Yeah, these are people she's lived with for the last 15 years, essentially. And one of the main people who circulates the rumours is her stepdaughter, James's daughter, Princess Anne, who's writing back to her sister Mary in Holland, and she's writing full, detailed reports. Anne was not there. Anne made sure that she was not present at the birth. She went to Bath to take the waters, and there's a sense of, if you don't want to have to testify as to what you saw, then don't be there, I think. And she made sure she wasn't there. So she's writing these letters back to Mary during the pregnancy, in which she's saying, oh, I think it's all very suspicious. It's very likely to not be true. I mean, that's sort of tip of the iceberg, really. I mean, she's really savage in these letters about them. I don't know at what point she really turned on them, because they had been very close when Maria first arrived, but this is a relationship that's gone very, very sour. And these are really, really nasty letters that she's writing back. Once the baby's born, she takes sort of testimony from people who were there, and she reports back what was seen to Mary. And this is not the only instance of testimony being taken, by the way. James also, basically everyone who was in the room was asked to report on what they saw. and particularly Protestants. As I said, the word of a Catholic is not doesn't matter so much at this time, because it's sort of thought, well, of course the Catholics will lie because they want this child to be king. So the testimony is taken, and it's taken over and over and over again for decades. The main person who is interviewed is a woman called Margaret Dawson. So Margaret Dawson was Maria's Lady of the Bedchamber, and this was a post that she'd held under Ann Hyde as well. And she, first of all, she was a Protestant, but she'd also been present at every single one of the births of James's legitimate children. So all of the children with Anne Hyde and all of the children with Maria, she'd seen every single birth. And so she was asked basically about, what did you see during the pregnancy? You know, was it all sort of normal? Did her breasts leak milk in the way they normally do? Like all of these, every single thing that may have happened to Maria during pregnancy was reported on, and she was assessed if it aligned to the other pregnancies that she'd had. And it was the same with the birth. She was asked constantly, Margaret Dawson particularly, was constantly asked what she saw. And even when she was a very old woman, people used to go and see her about it. She became a sort of celebrity. I mean, even the poet Alexander Pope went to see her and asked what she saw. You know, it was a sort of an event. It was a thing to do, to go to her about it. This is decades later. She's still being asked. So it becomes, you know, what happened that day is a source of greater fascination, even when you get to the sort of the Georges.
Right, right, because it opens the door to all of that.
Yeah.
So people in power decide to believe, they choose to believe this absurd story. And then what happens? What is the fallout of their stand is that it is not, although the baby is alive, it is not a legitimate heir. Either it's a fake baby or she was seduced and it's her baby, but not James's baby. But in any case, it is not a true heir.
Exactly. And then immediately after the baby is born, you get, so people like John Evelyn sort of wrote in his diary, you know, a baby boy, not much rejoicing, sort of, you know, this sort of sense of like, oh, you know, what will happen now? That there's a lot of that. Very, very few people actually rejoicing. Even people who are going to stay loyal are still not rejoicing.
Right.
So what essentially happens is there are 7 men, prominent men in the country. Some are parliamentarians, some are noblemen. They're called the Immortal Seven. Now they're known as that. They wrote a letter to William of Orange, the husband of Princess Mary, James's daughter. William, who was also James's nephew, so his sister, also Mary, had married into the House of Orange. So his nephew, his daughter, the Immortal Seven write him a letter, and in this they say what has happened, basically, that this child has been born, that it is not legitimate, that it is being masqueraded as the Prince of Wales, and they essentially ask William to invade England. And this is something that William's ready for. So throughout the pregnancy, he's had his own people in London, keeping an eye on things, seeing how it's all progressing. Before much before this letter, he basically has said, I'm ready to sail anytime. I'm just waiting for your invitation. And so that invitation comes just a few months after the baby's born. And he sets sail with an enormous fleet. I mean, it's an armada, essentially, you know, thousands of men. And he lands on the shore of Torbay at Devon on the 5th of November, particularly chosen as a sort of the day of ritual Catholic hatred in this country, commemorating the gunpowder plot and commemorating the failure of the gunpowder plot, I should say, and the execution of those associated with it. So he arrives on this day, you know, completely designed to stoke up anti-Catholic sentiment, and he makes his way up through the country. So at this point, it seems like there could actually be a civil war about to start. You know, James also gets his army, and they're basically ready to fight. But what happens doesn't quite go that way. So firstly, he has chronic nosebleeds. James begins having these chronic nosebleeds, probably brought on by stress. And he cannot go out to see his troops. And this is a big problem because they need to see their king, they need to be rallied. They need, this is a huge army, and they know that the Dutch army, the Dutch fleet are very, very famous, powerful fighters. So they do need to be stoked up a little bit, and they can't see their king, and he hasn't come out to see them, and that sends a very bad message. He also can't really admit that the reason he's not gone out is because he's got nosebleeds, because that seems like a great sign of weakness.
Mhm.
So that's the first thing that goes wrong. And then some of his very, very trusted close friends and advisors leave him. So the first is John Churchill, Sarah Churchill's husband, who I mentioned before, was a maid of honour to Maria when she first arrived. John Churchill had been a real protege of James. He'd sort of met him as a young teen, basically, and he'd raised him up, and he'd given him all of his sort of opportunities, if you like. And John Churchill's sister Arabella was also one of James's mistresses, and he had children by her. So John is also the uncle to some of his children. And John leaves him. He switches sides. He's been chatting to William a lot over the years, and he's planned to change sides. He takes with him George of Denmark, who's Princess Anne's husband. Anne and Sarah Churchill also leave Whitehall Palace, and they go to join. And there are several other people who go with them, and they take their armies with them. So we've got depleted numbers, a real kind of sense of loss, a sense of betrayal. James has just been left alone, and it's quite clear really that he's never going to win any kind of battle that he might start. He goes back to London. He sends Maria and the baby off to France for safekeeping, and I guess he tries to work out initially what to do. He doesn't go with them straight away, but it's not very long before he does leave and goes into exile in France too, dropping the Great Seal in the River Thames in the hope that that will mean they can't govern without him. But of course, that's taken as a sign of abdication. And so it really paves the way, in fact, for William and Mary to be crowned joint monarchs instead of him. It gives a kind of legal premise for that, if you like.
Yes. And so now it's based on that, his abdicating, whether, whatever with the baby, he abdicated. So that's on him. So William and Mary are crowned. And often, if you're just sort of looking at the English history track, William and Mary are crowned, and then you just go on through William and Mary, and then Anne, and then, but Maria and James are still around. So tell us what's happening with them. Okay, we know William and Mary, but what's happening with Maria?
So it's by no means certain at this time that what has happened is what's going to remain the case.
Right.
As you said, it's very, very easy in hindsight for us to sort of be like, well, and then the Glorious Revolution happened, and everything just kind of went along this way, and we had birth of modern democracy, and depending on your politics, things got much better. Really, you have the kind of formation of the Bank of England. This is a time of great constitutional changes, but it's essentially the beginning of the kind of constitutional settlement that we recognise now in the UK. So this is, as I said, essentially that moment of the birth of modern democracy. It's the end of any possibility of an absolute monarchy. But when this happens in 1688, 1689, they don't know what's going to happen. James could just as easily come back. He's gone to France. Louis supports him. Louis might give him, his entire army for all they know. And essentially, this is the kind of thing that does happen. There are battles. It is true to say that moment in 1688 was a bloodless coup, was a bloodless revolution. But blood was certainly shed in the following years. There are battles that happen. This is certainly not something that happens quietly. So James and Maria are still fighting, literally, to regain their throne. They are unsuccessful, and this can't kind of go on forever. So they're living essentially in exile in France, and they have to essentially accept that up to a point. They're given the palace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and that's where they live. They have a court. Many people left England to go with them. So lots of them Catholics, but also a lot of them are just royalists who believe in that kind of in the system, if you like. They believe there's still a king, and that that king has had a son, and if you, whether you like it or not, you can't sort of just replace them, because it, well, it does essentially make a mockery of, you know, of the
Mm-hmm.
business, doesn't it? So there are just loyalists who go with them who are not Catholics as well. So they have this court in France, and that's essentially where they live, constantly trying to find ways to get the throne back and to try and have their son's place recognised. When they're in exile, Maria also becomes pregnant again, and Mary and William and Anne over in England are invited to come and witness that birth. You know, this child might be a boy. Why didn't you come and see if you think this one's real? They refuse. In fact, I don't think they even respond. The child is a girl anyway, so it wouldn't necessarily have changed things too much. But you know, these are some of the ways in which they're still negotiating, trying to get it back. As time goes on, when Mary in England died and William was still king, there was some negotiation over the boy, you know, this warming pan baby being going back as king after that. And the offer is extended to him on the grounds that he convert to Protestantism. And at this point, it's James and Maria who refuse on his behalf. He's still very young. They say if he's only coming back as a Catholic, he can't, you know, he's not doing that. When the girl is born and Princess Anne over in England, she has a son at this point, there's talk of their marriage. If they were to marry, we can kind of unite these families back. It can all just sort of blow over, because then their child will be monarch, and that will all be fine. But then Anne's son dies, and so that goes out of the window. When Anne is old and she's thinking about her future, or the future of the country, she again extends that invitation. You can come back as king if you convert to Protestantism. And this boy at that point is older. He can decide for himself, and he says, no, I'm a Catholic. You have me back as a Catholic or not at all? And obviously the answer is not at all. And Parliament pass a bill which says that no Catholic will ever sit on the English throne again, and the Hanoverians become rulers after Anne dies. But you know, the child and his son, you know, you have the old pretender and the young pretender, they end up being called. They're still battling to get the throne back. They're still leading Jacobite uprisings. This is not something which ends. This is still going on through the reign of George I. And you know, there's always this, I think by that point it's very unlikely that they're going to win. But I certainly think it'd be wrong to assume that they just sort of went into exile and then waited it out
Right.
quietly.
And in Scotland, there were a lot of
Mm.
people who still recognized them as kings of Scotland. So they had, in some ways, that safe haven from which to try and invade England. And that was a, you know, a reasonable or a real possibility. It didn't happen and it became less likely, but it wasn't zero game.
And you're right. So Scotland did support. So James had actually, when he was in exile, he'd spent before he became king. When he was in exile, he'd spent some of that in Scotland as High Commissioner, and he was really seen as a Scottish prince in a way. You know, when the Scottish Stuarts became the monarchs of England, mostly those early ones hadn't really taken much note of Scotland. You know, James I had promised to go back, and I don't know if he did. Maybe one time he
Yeah.
went back. Charles I again, I think, you know, he maybe went one time. It wasn't really. It was quite clear to Scotland they'd been left behind, I think, by those early Stuart kings. Whereas, you know, James, when he was there, he was in exile, sure, but he's there. He's he's the heir to the throne, and he's in Scotland. And I think there's a sense that he, particularly, but also Charles II a little bit, there's a sense that they are Scottish kings, and that's important, and it's certainly not to be underestimated. So yes, you're right. You know, Scotland on the whole did support that Jacobite claim.
So while all this is going on, what's Mary doing? Because she does not just fade away. And I think this is where, in particular, she disappears from many of the narratives about this time. There's some focus on the wars, but it's just as if Mary disappears, and that's not true at all.
Yeah, so one of the things we've not touched on so much, but is important about Maria, is that throughout her life in England, one of the ways that she made herself a success was by essentially being a patron, I suppose you'd say. I mean, she's come from this este soft power. The way that you demonstrate your power is through patronage. You know, you commission artists, you commission poets, you commission music. You become a kind of intellectual, cultural presence, and that is a very powerful way of wielding your power, because it's a way of literally having a record of your greatness. That's what these poets do. That's what these painters do. So she was very active in that in England as Duchess of York, a little bit less as Queen, but she had a lot of other stuff to be getting on with in those 3 years. But I mean, you know, there are certainly at the beginning of her reign, there are clear, she's clearly going in that direction, but certain events like the birth of her child take over that. But so throughout this time as Duchess of York, she's a real patron, and she's particularly a patron to women. So these maids of honor at her court that I was talking about from the painting, you know, this is sort of one example of this environment that she created in which women were able to live with some kind of intellectual and creative freedom, which was very much denied to them in the sort of society they lived in. So of course there were women who produced art, whether it was sort of painting or writing, but they did not have those opportunities as a standard. And she created a world in which those around her at least could. This is something I think which to some extent carries on in exile. Certainly patronage in general carries on in exile. I mean, she's having paintings done of her and James and the children as the royal family of England with, you know, full ermine and crown. And she's having these pictures sent out across the courts of Europe. These are ways of kind of carrying favor and saying, look, we're still these monarchs, will you help us? So she understands, I think, how a power works when you don't really have any power. You know, how you make it is definitely something she's very, very active in exile. But the other thing she gets to do in exile is she gets to go back to a convent life, essentially. So there is a convent which Henrietta Maria had actually founded, so her mother-in-law, when Henrietta Maria had also been in exile in France, you know, where she was from. She had founded this convent. This is basically where Maria ended up. This is where it was of the same order that she'd wanted to join in Modena. And this is where she would go, and she would spend time with the sisters there. And, you know, she was recreating that life that she'd lost in Modena, essentially. And, you know, she was much younger than James, as we know, and she outlived James by a number of years. And she increasingly spent her time in this convent, and that was where she was to be found. I suppose she became the patron of the convent.
Well, and so I think that's wonderful because we lose sight of her, but that doesn't mean she disappeared. In reality, she was continuing to lead in the way that she could. And you mentioned that, you know, through her patronage, she did become a leader and an advocate for her family, for other women in the way that she could. So without being on the throne, she still made this huge impression. And I love that idea that she's commissioning these portraits, and you can see them. They're fabulous, and they are very much a royal portrait. And so she's creating that. You know, that's really wonderful that she's commissioning these and promoting her family and their claim to the throne in the way that she can. So, having told us this wonderful story, if there were one or two just main misconceptions about her that you would really like to correct of our understanding of Maria, what would that be?
So something which circulated when she was queen, and particularly when she was in exile, were, and you know, is accompanying images a lot of the time, was this sense that she was a kind of bigoted, you know, sort of bigoted, you know, fanatic, essentially, and that, you know, and I think the sort of sense of her as the Catholic queen who brought down a monarchy who was really bigoted, and I think this is absolutely something I would like to challenge. I think it's very easy when little is left behind of the past, particularly about women, and all you're kind of left with pieces of propaganda. It's quite easy to sort of to think that in the absence of other evidence, then that's going to be the thing that you believe is true. But she wasn't at all like that. And if anything, she was far more moderate than lots of the people around her. She was certainly more moderate than a lot of the Protestants around her. and and I think that the picture that I got when I was researching her, and I hope comes through in the book that I've written, is that she was funny and smart and clever and bright, and she was respected for that she was respected for that at the time, and she was loved for that at the time. When she arrived 15 years old and she leaves 30 years old, this is a young person that we're talking about, and most of that time is actually spent commissioning masks and commissioning paintings and ingratiating herself with people, and learning English as quickly as she could. She has so many incredible qualities that are not at all fanatical or bigoted. So I think that's one of the main things that I would like to say about her. She's also exceptionally resilient. And you think of how much she went through, and reading her letters, she's just always, what are we going to do about it? And I think that's something which is really spectacular. It's not necessarily something, a kind of myth I'd like to sort of challenge, because I don't think people necessarily think either way about her, but I think it's important to know that she was an incredibly strong, resilient person. The other thing is, if anyone has still believed that warming pan scandal after all these years, I definitely want to challenge the truth of that. The other thing, I suppose the other main thing would just be to say that she's not very well known, and just because she wasn't very well known doesn't mean she wasn't important. History is always written by the victors, and this is a period which we don't talk about, perhaps in part because it was so pushed under the rug after it happened. This is something that politically they wanted forgotten. So I think that in some ways trying to pull this history back to life is in itself quite a challenging thing to do, trying to know where to find the information, how to reconstruct it, and how to challenge what's been written about it, how to keep in mind that most of what we have is what's been deliberately left behind, and what we don't have is a lot of the time what's deliberately been taken away. So I think that, yes, the other thing I'd like to sort of challenge is this sense that because we don't really know about her, she can't have mattered. She mattered enormously, not just as a person, but also for this event, which absolutely transformed British history.
Right. And how important that was, and how important her role in that was, and her ongoing role as she continued. I mean, those ongoing Jacobite rebellions, she was really important in that. And just because they didn't win the battles doesn't mean it wasn't important, like you
Yeah,
say.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So, will you hold up your book so we can see
Yes.
the image that you've been talking about and the graces? Isn't that
I
beautiful?
should show you actually the picture
Oh, yes,
that
please.
inspired my book, if you can see.
Oh, yes. All right. That is beautiful. So, as we wrap up, and thank you for taking all this time with me. I just am so appreciative. Let me just say, if you were able to have Maria have dinner with Maria, is there a question that you would, maybe one or two, that you would really like to ask her?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. There are probably so many. And in terms of the politics of what went on, I'd like to know if she knew the extent to which Anne and Sarah Churchill were turned against her. I'd like to know if she knew what happened and when.
Mm.
And when she realized, was she surprised when she found out what had happened? Because she was definitely surprised about Princess Mary, because after the birth of the baby, she's still writing letters to Mary in which she's calling her. She used to call her, after she married the Prince of Orange, she used to call her lemon in a sort of like citric joke. And so she's writing to her after the baby to her dear lemon. So she obviously doesn't think anything's wrong there, or she wouldn't be using those terms of endearment. So I'd like to know when she realized that these relationships were going sour, and why she thought that happened, because it's something which has kind of mystified me. Yeah, I know that Anne and Sarah were both very, they were both strong Protestants, and the religious angle is certainly significant enough on its own, but there must be a point at which something turned. These things don't just happen all of a sudden. So I'd like to know more about that. I'd also like to know how extensive her patronage was beyond what has been recorded. I'd like to talk to her more about, especially with the women that she was supporting. You know, I'd like to know more about what they produced and things like that. I'd like to know, particularly someone like Anne Killigrew. So little of the work still survives, and she was such an ambitious and brilliant writer and artist. So I'd like to know more about how that was operating beyond what I've been able to reconstruct.
Oh, those are wonderful, wonderful questions. So as we continue to explore, that's part of history, is continuing to learn and not just taking everything at face value the way it was recorded by people who wanted us to remember it a certain way, right? So
yeah,
that's
exactly.
part of the power of the exploration. Well, tell us what's in store for you now. What are you working on now? And where can we find and follow you to keep up?
So in terms of any of the work that I do, I tend to put up on my website. So whether that's writing work or podcasts like this, or if I'm going to do any events, anything like that, you can find that all on my website, which is just breezebarrington.com. I also put things on Instagram sometimes, and I'm on Substack, but I'm taking a little step back at the moment while I sort of work out where I'm going with it. But those are the places where you can access the different bits of work that I'm up to. So, I mean, at the moment, I'm gearing myself up again for my next big project. And so I won't say too much about it, but I'm getting close to a point of writing, and it's going to be very different. So that's what I'll
Okay.
say.
Okay. Well, I will put the links in the show notes so we can keep up with you. And hopefully we can have a conversation about that when it
Absolutely.
happens.
Absolutely. It is still fermenting like the
Okay.
Graysons did before.
Okay. Well, that's some of the fun stuff, is just
Yeah.
thinking and letting it bubble in your head. So, well, that's wonderful. And we will eagerly watch to see what that is that's very different. But in the meanwhile, thank you so much for this brilliant look at a woman that is so often overlooked, but made such an impact on history, and particularly on the patronage of women, and how important that is to see these women in their own lives being leaders and having influence, and the soft power and the difference that makes. And so thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of this.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening and learning more about these extraordinary women of the time, these crazy stories that really happened. Some of the best fake news was that warming pan baby scandal. and all the ways. Thank you for joining us to continue to learn how history shows us what's possible and keeps teaching us today. So thank you, and we'll see you again soon with Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Carol Ann, and I really appreciate your being here. I can't wait to join you again as we keep exploring how history shows us what's possible.